So the money is here. The appetite for risk is here. Malaysians will absolutely gamble. What almost nobody in this country will do is write a 2 million ringgit check into a company. So when we see someone stand up and say Malaysia needs more financing for startups, the honest response is, does it? On the 27th of July, in a bank tower in Petaling Jaya, Kuala Lumpur, the Malaysian government announced more than 5 billion ringgit of financing for Malaysian startups. It has been a week. I still cannot tell you who is giving it, not because it is a secret, but because I haven't seen anybody publish the list. The minister said 15 organizations. The fullest account any newspaper ran named 12, and it introduced them with the word among. So somewhere out there, there are 3 institutions holding a share of 5 billion ringgit for Malaysian founders, and not one outlet in the country seems to be able to tell you their names. Um, and here is the thing: I'm not going to spend this episode telling you Malaysia has no money. That is a lazy version, and it is not true. Malaysia has enormous amounts of money. It is 30 billion ringgit sitting in committed venture and private equity funds, according to the Securities Commission. It has 160 billion ringgit of data centers going up in Johor. And 2 weeks before that press conference, Malaysian retail investors queued up with 1.4 billion ringgit in cash to buy shares in one small AI company on the ACE market. 1.4 billion for a company raising about 20 million. So the money is here. The appetite for risk is here. Malaysians will absolutely gamble. What almost nobody in this country will do is write a 2 million ringgit check into a company with no revenue and then wait 8 years to find out if they were wrong. That is not a funding gap per se. That is a temperament gap. And you cannot fix a temperament gap with a press release. I'm Kevin Brocklin. This is Sea of Startups. Real, raw, relatable. Now, let's get into it with today's episode. So, start with what was actually announced, because the detail is better than the headline. The event was called Techno Mart Malaysia High Tech Financing 2026. It was run by MOSTI, the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, and it was launched by the minister himself on the 27th of July at Manada MBSB bank in Petaling Jaya. His words, and I want to be fair and quote him properly. We have connected 15 organizations, including funding agencies and financial institutions. Together, they provide funding worth about 5 billion ringgit to support our startups and innovators. Now, 4 things about that sentence. First, the verb. He said connected, not allocated, not committed, not budgeted, connected. And he was straight about it when a reporter pushed him, because a reporter did ask whether the 5 billion was for this year alone. His answer was that it is an aggregated funding pool from the participating organizations covering about a year and a half. Aggregated. That word is doing a lot of work. It means nobody created a fund. 15 institutions added up the financing capacity they already had on their books over 18 months, and someone put the total on a banner. Not one ringgit changed hands in that event, just aggregated. Second, And to his credit, the minister said the quiet part himself. He said the financing is not distributed automatically, and that it is subject to each institution's own eligibility requirements. That is an honest caveat, and he did not have to offer it, so credit where credit is due, but sit with what it means. There is no single door. There are 15 doors, and behind each one is a different credit committee with a different form, a different collateral test, and a different definition of the word startup. Third, Technomart is not new. It has been running since 2018 and has delivered more than 30 programs. It is a matchmaking platform. It puts technology companies in a room with financiers. That is a genuinely useful thing to do. And I want to say that plainly because the commercialization gap in Malaysia is real. The minister called it the Valley of Death, and he is right that it exists. It is just not a new pot of money. It got reported like one, however. Fourth, the list. And this is where it stops being funny. So New Straight Times article named 3 participants. You had Meranti, MBSB Bank, which hosted the event, and XM Bank. Business Today added MDF. Malaysia Tribune ran the longest list and named 12. Cradle, SME Bank, Malaysia Debt Ventures, Pemodalan, Meranti, Bioeconomy Corp, ADFM, XM Bank, MTDC, Venture Tech, QOP, PMB, you put every outlet together and you get 14 distinct names. And not one of those reports claims to be a complete list. And look at what is on it. SME Bank, Exim Bank, Malaysia Debt Ventures, MBSB, MIDF. Those are lenders. Development banks, institutions whose entire discipline is getting the principal back. There is real equity in there. You have Cradle, MTDC, Venture Tech. Those are equity vehicles that I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The minister himself listed the instruments: grants, equity, debt, guarantees, blended finance, and working capital. Equity is in the mix. But what nobody has published is how much of the 5 billion is equity. There's no split, not by instrument, not by institution, not by stage. You were told the total and seemingly asked to be impressed. And one of the 15 is ADFMIM, which is the Association of Development Finance Institutions of Malaysia. It's a trade body. It represents lenders. It does not lend. So I'm not sure how the reporting put that name in there. So we are already at 14 funders and I guess a members club. But here's the part that actually changed how I read this story. 5 days later, the same NST reporter filed a second piece, different subject. MBSB Bank, the bank that hosted the event, in its own tower, announced it is committing 4 billion ringgit to what it calls high growth, high value industries. 1 billion for each rail, aerospace, automotive, and renewable energy. And the chairman gave that quote, and I'm trying to quote the paper here, on the sidelines of the Technomart Malaysia High Tech Financing 2026 event. Same room, same day. Now, I want to be a little careful because this matters and I'm not going to overstate it. Neither article says MBSB's 4 billion is part of MOSTI's 5 billion that it referenced. No source links them. I chased this. I could not close it because MOSTI never published a breakdown. So it's a little conflated. So there are 2 possibilities and you can pick either one. Possibility 1, The 4 billion is inside the 5 billion, in which case 80% of the headline startup financing pool is one bank's sector lending strategy. And the startups in question are rail suppliers and solar farms. Possibility two, it is separate, in which case MOSTI's 5 billion is spread even thinner across the other 14 institutions than it already looked. There is there's no seemingly third possibility where this number means what the headline said it meant. Um, and one more detail, because it is quite a descriptive sentence. MBSB described this push as diversifying beyond its traditional strength in property financing. A property lender is moving into industrial lending. That is a perfectly sensible corporate strategy. I have no quarrel with that. It is just not startup capital, and it got filed under startup capital in this initial announcement.
You started a company to build a product, not to run a back office. But here you are. You pay an accounting firm every month, and once a year, you get a clean set of accounts. That is compliance. It's not clarity. It will not tell you if you run out of cash in March. It will not tell you what one new hire does to your runway. And it will not answer the question every investor asks: where's this business heading? So I built your CFO, your back office in a box. Your books keeps your accounting books current, and your CFO puts your forecast forward. In one login, your actuals flowing straight into your outlook. Link your strategic initiatives, like a hire or a price change, to exactly what it does to your runway before you commit. Investor ready, operationally ready, in the currency that you work in. It is the back office I run across my own companies. Get your finances settled for your business today at yourcfo.tech. That's yourcfo.tech.
So, right. So that is the announcement. Now, let us do the thing this show exists to do, which is ask what actually happened last year with money that already exists. So, if you look at the Securities Commission, they published its capital market master plan back in March. In it is a number that should be the headline of most startup stories for the next 12 months, and I've seen almost nobody really use it. At the end of 2025, Malaysian venture capital and private equity together held 30.1 billion ringgit in committed funds. In that same year, venture and private equity together deployed 2.8 billion ringgit across 170 deals. 30 billion committed, 2.8 billion out the door. It's 10%. And be careful with that 2.8, because I am going to be careful with it myself. That is venture and private equity combined. The venture slice on its own is smaller. Of the 30 billion committed, only about 6 billion is venture at all. The other 24 is private equity, which buys profitable companies. Different animal, different risk, different sport entirely. So when we see someone stand up and say Malaysia needs more financing for startups, the honest response is, does it? Because there is 30 billion ringgit sitting in committed funds in the country, and it moved 2.8 billion in a year. Adding a 15-door lending pool to that does not necessarily solve the problem per se. It's the wrong end of the pipe, I think. And if you want the sharpest version of this, look at the new entity underneath Khazanah, the new National Fund funds. It was set up specifically to try and fix this. 1 billion ringgit mandated to back Malaysian venture managers so they can back Malaysian founders. Right instrument, right idea, no criticism of the surface level. But in February, reported the results for the year to end of December. Its first 5 fund managers had backed more than 10 startups, and they say they crowded in more than 30 million ringgit. 30 million, 10 companies from a 1 billion ringgit national fund to fund. Now, mind you, fund to funds are slow by design. First 5 managers, early days, capital calls take years. They still need to raise. That is all true, and I will defend it. But hold that 30 million next to a 5 billion ringgit banner and tell me which number actually describes the situation. And you can see the same shape in the budget. Budget 2026 raised the combined equity allocation across QOPs, Dana Parintis, and Kazanas Jelawong to 750 million ringgit. Cradle got 55 million for equity programs. The co-investment fund got 200 million. In that same budget, over 50 billion ringgit in loans and guarantees for entrepreneurs. 50 billion of debt, under a billion of equity. That is the capital stack in 2 numbers. And I understand why, because debt is, I think, politically easy. A guarantee costs nothing until it is called. A loan comes back in theory, and those who announced it is retired by the time it does. Equity means a civil servant has to sign off on losing public money on purpose, 7 times out of 10, and then explain that to the Public Accounts Committee. I don't think anybody is getting promoted for a portfolio that is down 70% on the way to one winner. So nobody really builds one that way. That is it is not due to uh incompetence. It is an incentive structure working exactly as designed and producing precisely the wrong thing by design. Now, here's where I change my own mind a little bit, and I want to walk you through it because I came into this story ready to talk about the usual piece about Malaysians being risk averse. And I think that piece is not wholly accurate because if we look at the 9th of July, SRKK AI listed on the ACE markets, small company, Microsoft partner, digital transformation work, AI services, the kind of business that would struggle to raise a Series A from regional venture fund, to be honest. Um, the retail tranche of that IPO was oversubscribed 312.3 times. 29,428 applications, 1.4 billion ringgit of retail money, chasing 14.2 million shares. It nearly doubled on its first day. Read those numbers again, because they essentially demolish the risk aversion story. Nearly 30,000 ordinary Malaysians put 1.4 billion ringgit in a queue to buy a slice of a relatively unproven AI company, not a bank, not a plantation, an AI company. And it was not a one-off. Bursa had 33 new listings by the middle of June, 22 of them on the ACE market. Pentech raised 34 million, Some Technology 33, Computer 26. In July alone, Stratus Global raised 285 million ringgit at a valuation near a billion. Now, compare that to the venture side. Through April, Malaysian startups had raised about 94 million US dollar across 11 equity rounds. Call it 400 million ringgit for the whole country for the year to that point. Malaysian retail investors put 3.5 times that into the queue for one small cap listing in a fortnight. So, no, Malaysia does not lack risk appetite per se. Malaysia has a ferocious risk appetite, I think, actually. It is just extremely specific about the terms. It wants a ticker, it wants a prospectus, it wants a regulated exchange, a listed price, and the ability to be out by Thursday. What it will not do is lock money up for 8 years, 10 years in something illiquid, unpriced, and possibly will fail. And honestly, that is a rational preference. If I could get exposure to an AI company with daily liquidity and a regulator standing behind the disclosure, the same exposure through a 10-year fund with no distributions, and a manager I've never met, I know which one my auntie is probably picking. The same pattern shows up at the other end of the scale. Take Johor, where we've talked about Malaysia's data center market there, which is now worth about 160 billion ringgit. It has the largest incoming pipeline in the Asia Pacific, over 8,500 megawatts. Co-location vacancy is 0.7%. In the first half of this year, a single Australian operator committed 12.7 billion ringgit for 2 facilities. 12.7 billion from one company for 2 buildings. That is more than double what 15 institutions took a press conference to announce for every startup in the country over 18 months. So let us put the whole thing on one line, because this is the argument of the episode. When Malaysia is asked to fund a building, it finds 160 billion. When it is asked to fund a listed share, it finds 1.4 billion in a fortnight for one company. When it is asked to fund a founder, it holds an event. The constraint was never capital. It was never appetite. It is that this country has not built the one thing that converts appetite into a term sheet, which is a class of people whose actual job is to be early, be wrong most of the time, and get paid for the few times they are not. 3 things to finish. Then I will get out of your ears and wrap things up here. So first, the leak. On the 16th of July, a study by Oxford Economics modeled what Malaysia's digital regulation is doing to private investment. It said that if we took it a restrictive path, it projects venture investment falling 26% by 2035. That's roughly 792 million ringgit a year and about 22,000 fewer startup jobs. The survey underneath it is worse than the model. 81% of startups report higher compliance costs. 39% now spend more than 15% of their operating cost on compliance. And 67% say money has come out of research and development to pay for it. The rules in question are the amended Data Protection Act, the Cybersecurity Act, the Online Safety Act code that came into force on the 1st of June, and the AI governance bill that went to cabinet in June. Now, the honest caveat, and I am giving it to you because I could not resolve it, I could not establish who actually commissioned that study. It has the shape of an industry-funded research, and industry-funded research about the cost of regulating industry deserves a bit of a raised eyebrow. So weigh it accordingly. I'm not asking you to take the number as gospel, but it could be directionally. But even discounted heavily. The direction is the point. One ministry called a press conference to announce 5 billion ringgit over 18 months. Another is writing rules that could quietly remove 792 million a year. So we have a balance. One of those requires a stage and a photographer, and the other happens in a gazette on a Tuesday. Second, the scoreboard. Back in April 2024, Malaysia held the inaugural KL20 summit. 12 international venture firms pledged to set up funds and offices in KL. 3 sovereign and semiconductor funds pledged 3 billion ringgit. It was an impressive day of announcements. 2 years on, the published scoreboard is 5,005 startups registered on the My Startup platform and more than 24,000 people benefiting from the KL20 programs. Those are attendance figures, though. Registration is not capital. The beneficiary is not a company. The next summit was announced and still pending. I haven't seen anything come out of it, and it's seeming like it's going to have a great emphasis on venture capital. I went looking for more detail, couldn't really find it. And now I do want to be careful here because I cannot find it does not mean it's not happening. I'm not going to claim any of it. But it does have to raise a few eyebrows, considering the amount of promises and commitments that were announced with very much fanfare. Now, third, and this is the one that could sting a little bit, look at who actually wrote the equity checks into Malaysian companies this year. If you take Respond.io out of Kuala Lumpur, it raised $62.5 million, 35 million in annual recurring revenue, growing quite well. Genuinely good company, led by an American investor. Policy Street raised 21 million, a Series C first close, led by Cool Japan Fund. D-Cube raised 3 million, anchored by a Taiwanese fund. American, Japanese, Taiwanese, not Malaysian. The good news is that Malaysian companies are now good enough that foreign funds fly in for them, and that is real, and I will take it. The larger the amount of capital, the more global it is by nature. And so that is not a bad thing. But the uncomfortable news is that when the upside on these companies gets distributed, does not get distributed here. The domestic money stayed in the debt column where it is safe, where nobody gets blamed, and where nobody really gets rich off the startup ecosystem that way. So here is where I have ended up on this, talking through this. So Malaysia announced 5 billion ringgit for startups from a list of 15 institutions. It never really fully published, and a tower belonging to a property lender that is moving into other industries. In the same week that 30,000 of its own citizens queued up with 1.4 billion ringgit to buy a public listing. The money is here. The appetite is actually here. The talent is here. And I think that the ministry was right about that part. What is missing is the person willing to be early and wrong in public. And you do not get that person by announcing a number. You get them by building a place where losing money on purpose, most of the time, is a respectable job. Until then, I think Malaysia will keep holding events about the Valley of Death. And the Americans, Japanese, the Taiwanese, The foreign investors will keep flying in to buy the survivors. I'm Kevin Brocklin. This has been Sea of Startups. Real, raw, relatable. I'll see you next week.
And that does it for this episode of Sea of Startups. If you've enjoyed what you've been listening to, please give it a like, give it a review, subscribe to our channel. A little bit of feedback goes a long way in allowing us to keep on putting out these kind of episodes.